The Quiet Corner Café. The day had started like any other in downtown Los Angeles. A misty morning, kissed by the golden hue of a sun still waking behind hazy clouds. The streets were alive, but not loud. There was an unusual serenity in the air, a softness that made the morning feel like it was holding its breath for something extraordinary. Nestled between a rundown bookstore and a vintage record shop sat a quiet little cafe. It had no flashy signboard, no corporate logos, and no influencer hashtags trailing behind it. Just a simple bronze plaque near the door that read, "The Quiet Corner Cafe." A small chalkboard beside the entrance displayed the day's specials, hand-drawn with charming imperfection. Pumpkin spice chai, oat milk lattes, and blueberry scones. The cafe, though small, had a soul. People came not just for coffee or pastries, but for peace. Inside, jazz hummed through hidden speakers, and the walls, adorned with black and white photographs and handwritten poems, breathed warmth and wisdom. It was a place where you could be seen without being judged, a haven for the worn, the weary, the hopeful, and the kind. No one knew that the Quiet Corner Cafe was owned by Keanu Reeves. That was by design. Keanu had always been different from the Hollywood stereotypes. He never craved the glitz or the limelight. Fame followed him, sure, but he never chased it. What he did chase, however, was quiet impact, a life where the good you do doesn't need to be broadcast. He had purchased the cafe under a different name, working closely with a tight-knit team who understood his vision. Create a place that felt like home to the heartbroken, the dreamers, and the kind-hearted. He came in some mornings, usually disguised in a plain hoodie and jeans, helping clean up the tables, talk to staff, or sometimes even anonymously pay for customers' drinks. He never asked for recognition. He just wanted to be part of something that mattered. But on this particular morning, the universe had something else in store. Sandra Bullock had never been one to make a scene. She had lived through the extremes of fame, the red carpets, the screaming fans, the camera flashes, and the rumors. But beneath all that shimmer lived a woman who often sought solace in quiet spaces. She didn't crave attention. She craved authenticity. And lately, after the recent loss of her beloved father and a media storm around her taking time off from films, Sandra was more fragile than anyone knew. She had heard whispers about this hidden cafe. Her hairstylist had mentioned it in passing. It's small, cozy, has this mysterious charm. No paparazzi, no hype, just peace. That morning, wearing a beige trench coat, a beanie pulled low, and sunglasses, Sandra decided to find the place herself. She left her car a few blocks away, craving a walk to clear her mind. The streets seemed to understand her silence, the rhythm of her boots syncing with the quiet beat of the city waking up. And then she found it, the cafe with the golden plaque and the kind little chalkboard. She walked to the door, took a deep breath, and reached for the handle. But she never made it inside. The denial. "Excuse me, ma'am, this cafe is members only." The voice belonged to a young man, early 20s, wearing the cafe's green apron, a name tag that read Bryce. He stepped in front of the door, his hand lightly pressing it closed before Sandra could enter. "Oh, I'm sorry," Sandra said gently, removing her sunglasses to be polite. "I didn't see a sign about that." Bryce blinked. Recognition dawned. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Wait a minute. Aren't you Sandra Bullock?" She nodded awkwardly. "Yes, but I was just hoping for a quiet coffee. I heard this place was." Yeah, I know who you are. Listen, we're not really set up for celebrities." She tilted her head, confused. "I'm not here for attention. Just a coffee." Bryce smiled stiffly. "Right, but we've had some bad experiences. Paparazzi following actors in, disrupting customers, etc. The Quiet Corner is about low-profile people." Sandra's lips parted in shock. Her heart twisted, not because she had been recognized, but because she was being judged. "I'm not here with cameras. I came alone," she said quietly. Still, It's better if you find another spot. There's a Starbucks 2 blocks away." There was no shouting, no anger, just an awkward silence. People walking by didn't stop. No one noticed. It was just Sandra and Bryce at the threshold of the cafe, with kindness hanging like a ghost that had forgotten to show up. Sandra stepped back. "Okay, thank you." She turned slowly, her throat tightening. She walked away. The witness. What Bryce didn't know was that Keanu Reeves had been inside the cafe all along. He had arrived early that morning, hours before opening, to help the kitchen team prepare scones, his favorite task. He loved rolling the dough, the feel of something tangible in a world often too digital, too fake. The back of the cafe had a small office with security monitors showing the front door and register. That's where Keanu had seen the entire exchange. At first, he watched out of habit, but when he saw the familiar figure in the trench coat, sunglasses removed, and her unmistakable grace, his breath caught. Sandra. Keanu hadn't seen her in years, not since a film festival where they had shared a dinner table and stories of old times. They had never been romantically involved, despite the rumors, but there had always been a silent, unspoken kinship. They understood each other in a way few in their industry did. They were both humble, both seekers of realness. And now she had just been turned away from his cafe. His cafe, for being too famous. Keanu's jaw clenched, not out of anger, but of heartbreak. He rushed to the front, but by the time he got there, Sandra was gone. The search begins. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold Bryce. He simply looked at the young man and said, "That woman is one of the kindest, most gracious people I know. And this cafe was built for people like her." Bryce blinked. "Wait, what? You know her?" Keanu nodded slowly, the weight of disappointment in his voice. "And I own this cafe." Silence. Bryce's face drained of color. "I didn't know." "Intentions matter," Keanu said quietly, "but so does compassion." And with that, Keanu grabbed his coat. He needed to find Sandra. A city of millions. Lay is not kind to those who chase ghosts. Finding one woman among millions in a city that thrives on anonymity is like trying to catch smoke in your hands. But Keanu didn't care. He walked block after block, stopping at street corners, peeking into coffee shops, his heart pounding not from exhaustion, but hope. Finally, he saw her. She was sitting on a park bench across from a fountain, coffee in hand, one she must have picked up at a nearby shop. She looked like someone trying to breathe after being underwater too long. Keanu approached slowly, cautiously, like not to disturb a fragile painting. "Mind if I sit?" he asked gently. Sandra turned. When she saw him, her eyes widened. Not with surprise, but something else. Relief, coffee, and closure. The sun had begun its slow climb toward the zenith, washing Los Angeles in a soft gold that gave even the hardest corners a temporary sense of grace. The park where Sandra sat wasn't famous. It didn't make the tourist lists or appear in anyone's Instagram highlights, but it was sacred in its own quiet way. Old trees lined the paths like silent guardians, and a circular stone fountain bubbled in the middle with water that had learned the rhythm of peace. The noise of the city dulled here, replaced by the murmurs of wind and the scattered laughter of children chasing pigeons. Sandra had picked this bench not because of any particular memory, but because it faced the sun just enough to warm her face and let her hide in the light. She hadn't noticed how much she missed just being someone without the armor, without the script, without the pressure to smile for the cameras or carry the expectations of a world that assumed her life was golden just because her name was known. When Keanu sat down beside her, he didn't speak right away, and neither did she. Some moments don't need an explanation. His presence was like the breeze, unannounced, but welcome. She turned her head slightly to look at him, her expression unreadable but soft, like the space between rain and mist. There was no anger in her eyes, no drama, no accusation, just a quiet curiosity, the kind that asked without demanding an answer, Why are you here?" He shifted, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together, as if holding something fragile between his palms. "I saw what happened," he said finally, his voice low, calm, and edged with remorse. "At the cafe. That shouldn't have happened, Sandra. I'm sorry." She tilted her head and let out a small exhale. Not a sigh, not quite, but something close to it. "You own that place?" she asked, her tone neutral but tinted with something ancient, like a scar that had long since stopped hurting but still remembered the pain. Keanu nodded, not looking at her but at the fountain in front of them, as if it held the confession he couldn't quite put into words. "Yeah, quiet corner. It's mine. I opened it a couple of years ago. Tried to keep it under the radar. A little sanctuary. I never wanted it to be a celebrity place. Just somewhere real people could breathe." Sandra leaned back against the bench, letting the sunlight catch the edges of her face, highlighting the lines time had drawn gently across her skin. "Well," she said, a faint smile curling the corner of her lips, "your staff succeeded in keeping the celebrities out." He chuckled softly, the sound laced with regret. "I deserve that." They fell into silence again. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that feels earned, like a deep breath after holding one's emotions too long. There were years between them since their last meaningful conversation. Hollywood had kept them near, but life had kept them far. Yet in this moment, they were just two people who had seen too much of life's brutal honesty, and were still trying to be kind despite it all. Sandra turned toward him more fully now, her expression no longer guarded. "Why a cafe, Keanu? You could have opened a foundation, built a retreat, funded 100 shelters. Why something as small as a cafe?" He looked at her, and for a second, she saw the boy still living inside the man, the one who had grown up with pain as a tutor and silence as a friend. "Because a cafe is personal," he said. "It's not about saving the world. It's about reaching the one person who needs a warm drink, a soft chair, and a place to be invisible or seen, whichever they need most. When I was younger, I used to go to this little shop off Sunset Boulevard. No one knew me there. The owner would just smile, hand me a cup of coffee, and nod like he knew I was trying. That place saved me more than once. I wanted to build something that could do that for others." Sandra's eyes glistened, not from tears, but from resonance. "I know what you mean," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After my mom passed, I used to find these little bookstores, quiet corners, like your cafe. I'd just sit, sometimes not even reading, just sitting. Those places kept me from disappearing." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's why I opened it. But today, when I saw you turned away like that, I realized we still have so far to go. Even in our havens." Sandra shook her head. "You can't control everyone, Keanu. You built something beautiful. You just have to guide it. People make mistakes. What matters is whether they learn from them." The two of them sat quietly again, the noise of the world slowly returning like background music to a very human scene. Pigeons fluttered by. A little boy walked past holding his father's hand, pointing at the fountain like it was made of gold. Keanu leaned back, a slow breath escaping him. "You know what," he said, smiling faintly. "You were one of the few people in this business who never made me feel like I had to perform off-camera." Sandra grinned, eyes glinting. "That's because I knew you didn't need to be someone else. You were already too good at being you." He laughed then, really laughed. The kind that bubbles up from the soul and shakes loose some of the heaviness life builds over time. She joined in, and for a moment, they weren't Hollywood icons or misidentified cafe visitors. They were just two old friends rediscovering the comfort of genuine connection. "I want you to come back," he said suddenly, "to the cafe. As my guest. As my friend. No disguises. No apologies. Just you." Sandra hesitated, not because she was unsure, but because the offer was so rare, so pure, that it took a moment to absorb. Only if we sit together, she said. He nodded. Deal. And just like that, something unspoken passed between them. A new chapter beginning not in neon lights, but in the quiet corners of a world that still had space for kindness, for healing, for starting over. As they walked back to the cafe, side by side, Sandra noticed how differently people looked at Keanu when they passed him. Not with screams or selfies, but with quiet smiles, like they knew he carried something rare. An energy that could hold space for pain and joy at once. They entered the cafe to stunned silence from the staff. Bryce, red-faced and trembling, stepped forward. Ms. Bullock, I'm so sorry. Sandra raised a hand gently. Let's not make a scene, she said kindly. We all have off days. Let's just make today better. Keanu smiled. We start over. That's what this place is for. And as Sandra took a seat by the window, the jazz began to play again. The scent of fresh pastries filled the air, and the cafe returned to its rhythm, not as a place for the elite, but as a home for the human. The cafe that love built. It was strange, Sandra thought, how some places could change the temperature of your soul without ever needing to touch you. The Quiet Corner Cafe wasn't just brick and wood or mugs and muffins. It was the kind of place where even the walls seemed to listen. The air carried with it a warmth that was hard to explain. It wasn't just the scent of cinnamon, roasted beans, or freshly baked scones. It was something more human, more sacred. It was the way people sat at their tables without feeling watched, the way silence wasn't awkward here, and the way even the quietest people somehow felt a little more seen. And for Sandra, who had spent so many years crafting characters while forgetting to honor her own stillness, sitting inside that cafe beside Keanu Reeves felt like arriving somewhere she didn't know she had been trying to get to. They didn't talk much at first. A knowing silence sat between them like an old friend. Sandra stared out the window at the soft blur of pedestrians, while Keanu watched the gentle bustle of the cafe unfold. He nodded at staff, whispered kind words to customers, and kept his posture relaxed in a way that said he belonged. Not as a star, not as an owner, but as a human being doing something meaningful. She'd seen that version of Keanu before, the one the cameras never truly captured. It was the version of him that lived in the pauses between his sentences, in the way he never interrupted, in the subtle grace of someone who had survived enough of life to stop pretending they needed to impress anyone. As the afternoon settled in, Keanu finally spoke, his voice soft like the wind stirring the napkins at the edge of their table. There's a story behind this place, he said, not looking at her, but at the heart-shaped leaf pressed against the outside of the glass. It's not something I talk about often. Sandra turned to him, folding her hands loosely in front of her. She didn't prod or pry. She simply offered the gift of attention, the rarest kind in their world, the kind that says, take your time. I'm here. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his fingers playing with the rim of his coffee cup. A few years ago, I was filming overseas. It was a tough shoot, emotionally heavy, long hours, and I was dealing with the anniversary of Jennifer's passing. His voice dipped when he said her name, almost as if it still hurt to let it out into the open. It hit me harder than I expected. I thought I was past the worst of it, but grief, it doesn't always come in waves. Sometimes it just waits for a moment of quiet and then crashes through the silence like it owns you. Sandra's heart tugged at the name. Jennifer Syme, Keanu's former partner, who had tragically passed away after the stillbirth of their child. She had always admired the way Keanu carried that pain, not loudly, not for sympathy, but with the dignity of someone who respected sorrow as much as joy. I remember being in a hotel room one night, he continued. Couldn't sleep. I walked out at 2 a.m, just wandering. Ended up in this tiny cafe that was still open. No one there except the barista and a woman mopping the floor. I sat down, ordered black coffee, and just stared out the window for, I don't know how long. No one bothered me. No one stared. At one point, the woman, she must have been in her 50s, came over and just placed a cookie on my napkin. Said nothing. Just smiled like she understood something about me I didn't even know yet. He paused, eyes distant, and Sandra could almost feel the ghost of that memory settle on the table between them. "That cookie saved me," Keanu whispered, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. Kindness without question, presence without pressure. It made me realize how much the world needs spaces like that, places where you can fall apart in peace or rebuild in silence. Sandra reached across the table, gently placing her hand over his. "So you built one?" He nodded. "I bought the building the next year. Worked with a local architect who specializes in sensory design. Colors, light, space. Everything in here is intentional. The jazz is tuned to human heart rhythm. The chairs, designed to encourage conversation, but also comfort solitude. The lighting mimics sunrise in the morning, sunset in the evening. Even the menu. Each item is someone's story. The scones are from an old recipe my mother used to make when I had nightmares." Sandra looked around with fresh eyes, suddenly aware of how everything felt both purposeful and welcoming. "This place isn't just a cafe," she said softly. "It's a letter to the world." Keanu smiled at that, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but tried. "It's my way of giving something back that I never got to give Jennifer, a place of rest. A place to just be." They sat in that truth for a while, the clinking of spoons and distant laughter playing background to their stillness. And then, slowly, something shifted, not just between them, but in the very energy of the cafe. Other customers had noticed her, of course. It was impossible not to. But no one asked for photos or autographs. Instead, they smiled gently, nodded respectfully, and returned to their conversations like they, too, understood the sacredness of the moment unfolding before them. And then something remarkable happened. An elderly woman sitting a few tables away got up and walked over to Sandra, holding a napkin folded in half. She looked nervous, but kind. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I overheard what happened this morning. And I just wanted to say, thank you for staying, for giving this place a second chance." Sandra took the napkin and opened it. On it, in beautiful cursive, were the words, "Kindness always circles back. Thank you for being someone who reminds us to look twice before we judge." Sandra's throat tightened as she looked up at the woman, who smiled and placed a hand gently over her shoulder before walking away. Keanu said nothing, but his eyes shone with a quiet pride, the kind that doesn't come from fame, but from watching the ripple of goodness spread from the tiniest pebble. The cafe, Sandra realized, wasn't just Keanu's legacy. It was a living, breathing extension of every moment he had chosen empathy over ego. It was where pain became poetry, where strangers became stories, and where even the broken parts of people were allowed to sit at the table. By the time they stood to leave, the sun had dipped low, casting long golden shadows across the wooden floorboards. Sandra looked back one last time before stepping outside, imprinting the space into her memory not just as a location, but as a feeling. "You ever think about expanding?" she asked as they walked down the sidewalk. Keanu chuckled. "People ask me that all the time. But no, some things are meant to be small. Not everything needs to scale. Sometimes the right thing is enough." Sandra nodded, her eyes soft. "Then let's make sure people know where to find it." Quietly. And in that moment, they both knew that something had changed, not just between them, but within them. A reconnection not just of two friends, but of purpose, of mission, of the belief that healing doesn't always require a stage. Sometimes it just needs a table, a warm drink, and someone who's willing to listen, where strangers leave lighter. The city didn't know it yet, but something subtle had begun to shift. It wasn't in the skyline, nor in the flashy headlines, nor even on the news. It was quieter than all that. It moved like breath beneath the noise, like the thread that holds a garment together without ever being seen. And at the center of that shift was the Quiet Corner Cafe. Not a chain, not a brand, Not a franchise built to spread profit, but a soul made of wood, brick, and intention. Keanu Reeves had always believed that real change didn't start with a crowd. It started with one person being seen. The week after Sandra returned to the cafe, things began to stir in ways no press release could manufacture. Word spread, not in loud social media posts or paparazzi snapshots, but in whispers, in memories, in moments that felt too real to keep to yourself. Someone's grandmother mentioned it to a friend at church. A postal worker, tired of being invisible all day, left a note on the corkboard by the counter that read, "I come here because this place remembers that people are not machines." The napkin notes became something more. They grew. Like vines climbing a wall of hope, they stretched across the bulletin boards and windows. Poems, confessions, thank yous, some written in shaky cursive, some in blocky crayon print. The staff didn't remove them. Keanu had insisted they be preserved. "Let them live," he had said. "Some people only get seen once." Among the newcomers was a woman named Rosa, mid-30s, eyes that carried the weight of too many battles and hands that had learned how to comfort babies, clean houses, and hide tremors. She came in on a Tuesday wearing a coat 3 sizes too big and a look that said she wasn't sure if she was allowed to stay. Sandra happened to be there, quietly sipping tea by the window, reading a dog-eared copy of The Prophet. She noticed Rosa hesitate at the door. Not because the staff was unkind. Keanu had retrained everyone with a new orientation focused on empathy, but because sometimes shame speaks louder than policy. Rosa stood there, back straight like armor, lips pressed like she was holding in breath or pain. Keanu, behind the counter that day, looked up and saw her. He didn't rush over or make a scene. He simply walked around, wiped a table near the door, and said, "There's no rush in here. Sit as long as you need." Rosa blinked, caught off guard. "Even if I don't order anything?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Especially then," Keanu replied, offering a smile that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with dignity. She sat. Eventually, she ordered a tea. That was the first day. Over the following weeks, Rosa returned. Bit by bit, her shell cracked. Not all at once. Healing doesn't work that way. But the cafe became her space of exhale. One afternoon, she sat across from Sandra. It was unplanned, spontaneous. Sandra had recognized her by now, not by name, but by energy. "You can sit here, if you want," Sandra said, moving her coat off the adjacent chair. Rosa sat. Minutes passed before either spoke. Finally, Rosa said, "I lost custody of my daughter. I'm trying to get clean again. Everyone keeps looking at me like I'm already gone. But not here." Sandra, touched but not surprised, leaned in gently. "Then this is where you start again." A few tables over, another story was unfolding. Javier, once a Michelin-starred chef, now worked the dishwashing station in the back. Keanu had hired him quietly, after finding him sleeping behind the building during renovations months ago. At first, Javier had refused the offer, pride choking his gratitude. "I don't need pity," he had snapped. Keanu had only nodded and said, "Then don't take pity. Take purpose." Something in those words cracked through Javier's storm. He had been working at the cafe ever since. He didn't wear a name tag, didn't pose for photos, but some mornings, when the smell of cinnamon filled the air and jazz played Miles Davis on vinyl, he would bake small pastries, tiny, delicate things filled with lavender or citrus or memory. He never announced them, just left them on the counter with a note. For anyone having a hard day, customers began calling them grace bites. They became legend. And then there was Malik. 16. Quiet. Carried a beat-up journal like it was his second skin. No phone. No headphones. Just a pencil always tucked behind his ear and questions in his eyes. He started coming in after school, always ordering the same thing, a hot chocolate with oat milk and one blueberry scone. He never spoke to anyone, just sat in the corner booth and wrote. One day, Keanu noticed the boy scribbling furiously, lips moving silently as if reciting a monologue. He walked over with 2 drinks. "I figured you might need a refill," he said. Malik looked up, startled, then gave a slow nod. Keanu sat down. "What are you working on?" he asked gently. Malik hesitated, then shrugged. "Letters." "To who?" Malik didn't answer right away. Then, with a voice cracked by the sharpness of adolescence and ache, he said, "To my dad. He left before I was born. But I write to him. Just in case he's out there. Just in case he ever wants to know me." Keanu didn't say much, just listened. At the end, he said, "Write them all. Don't stop. Because one day, you'll be the man he should have been. And you'll want to remember how far you came." The cafe didn't announce these things. There were no photo ops, no interviews, no viral posts. Just people. Real, fragile, hopeful people. And as Sandra watched all this unfold, day after day, she felt something in her own soul stitch itself back together. She began volunteering quietly, on days when she wasn't filming or speaking. She helped Rosa with parenting paperwork. She wrote thank you cards for Javier to tuck into his pastry boxes. She even helped Keanu renovate the upstairs loft into a reading room, filling it with donated books and overstuffed chairs. One evening, as they stood on the rooftop watching the city exhale into twilight, Sandra turned to Keanu and said, "You know this place is becoming a story, right?" He smiled, folding his arms as he looked at the flickering lights below. "I don't want it to be a story," he said. "I want it to be a reminder that good things are still real." She nodded. "Then maybe it's both." In the distance, the cafe lights glowed amber. Inside, Rosa laughed for the first time in years. Javier wiped his hands and whistled a tune from his childhood. Malik wrote the final sentence of a letter that began, "Dear Dad, I'm becoming someone you should have stayed to meet." And down on the sidewalk, a homeless man stared through the window at the warmth within. Before he could turn away, a staff member stepped outside and handed him a hot drink. No charge, no conditions, just kindness. The quiet corner cafe wasn't loud, but its echoes, they were beginning to travel. When walls are threatened, hearts stand up. It started with a letter, just a plain white envelope slipped under the cafe's door one quiet Wednesday morning before sunrise. The cleaning crew found it first, sitting alone on the doormat as if it had been left by a ghost. It wasn't postmarked, had no return address, only the cafe's name written in block letters across the front. Keanu was called down immediately. He arrived still wearing the jeans and hoodie he'd slept in, hair tousled, eyes tired but alert. Something in his gut already knew the peace they had carefully nurtured was about to be tested. He peeled the envelope open with deliberate fingers, almost as if trying to delay the inevitable. Inside was a legal notice, 5 pages long, typed in sharp, sterile language that lacked even the courtesy of emotion. But the message was simple. The building housing the quiet corner cafe had been sold to a new corporate developer, and with the sale came plans for demolition. The cafe would have 60 days to vacate. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, but Keanu's expression didn't falter. He simply exhaled, a long, quiet breath, and folded the letter in half. He stood there in the early morning stillness, surrounded by the warm scent of vanilla, and the first trickle of sunlight stretching across the wooden floors, and for the first time in a long time, the sanctuary he built felt suddenly fragile. But it wasn't panic that filled him. It was grief. The slow, aching kind that comes not from losing something, but from fearing the world may not understand why it mattered in the first place. Sandra arrived an hour later. She had come to help prep the upstairs reading loft, bringing with her a few donated novels and her usual warm smile. But when Keanu handed her the letter, her face changed. She read the words slowly, lips parting slightly as the weight of the notice settled into her chest like a stone. "They're turning it into what?" she asked, voice tinged with disbelief. "A luxury co-working space," Keanu said, leaning against the counter with a tired shrug. Probably with glass walls, overpriced smoothies, and a rooftop bar with an exclusive guest list. Sandra shook her head, pressing the letter to her chest. This isn't just a business, Keanu. It's a lifeline. He nodded. I know, but they don't. What followed over the next week was a slow unraveling of calm, a creeping tension beneath the surface of everyday kindness. The staff kept serving drinks, the pastries kept coming out of the oven, the jazz still played. But there was a new energy in the air, the kind that hinted something sacred was under siege. Regulars noticed first. Rosa, who now volunteered at the cafe 3 days a week, sensed something was wrong when she saw Keanu standing by the window for too long, lost in thought. Javier began waking up earlier, baking more than usual, leaving pastries wrapped in paper hearts on every table like little love letters to a place he feared he might lose. Even Malik, quiet and observant, left a note pinned to the corkboard that read, "If this place goes, some of us go with it." Word of the eviction spread, not by hashtags or trending tags, but by whisper, by soul, by people who understood that what they had found at the Quiet Corner Cafe could not be replicated by franchises or replaced with marble floors. It wasn't about the coffee. It was about the comfort, about knowing you could come in with your grief, your story, your silence, and be met with nothing but kindness. Sandra and Keanu began brainstorming ways to fight back. We could try to buy the building, she offered one night, sitting on the rooftop under a sky of city-lit stars. I've got connections. Maybe we can raise the funds. Keanu shook his head. They won't sell to us. I already tried. They want their footprint here, something that looks good on stock reports. He paused, thinking. But maybe we don't need to fight them alone. That's when the idea was born, not to resist with lawyers or money, but with stories. Real ones, human ones, the ones that no corporate board could argue with. They began gathering testimonies. Sandra reached out to every regular who had found healing within those walls. Rosa recorded a short video, standing in the very spot she had once hovered at in fear, now filled with grace. This place didn't just serve me tea. It gave me back my self-worth, she said, her voice quivering with truth. Javier allowed Keanu to film him baking, his hands moving through dough like memory. He spoke, not with pride, but with vulnerability. I was invisible. Here, I became human again. Malik read one of his letters aloud, his voice shaking but strong. I never had a father, but I found a place that listened like one. The videos were posted online, not on a flashy website or media outlet, but on a simple black and white blog titled The Heart of the Cafe. Within 24 hours, it had over 100,000 views, not because it was trending, but because it was true. Comments flooded in from strangers who had never been there but recognized something in those stories. Places like this saved me too. I wish we had a cafe like this where I live. Don't let the world lose another soul sanctuary. But perhaps the most unexpected response came from an unlikely source. A woman named Meredith Chan, CEO of a major architecture firm that had once done contract work for the same developers now planning to tear the cafe down, reached out. She had seen the videos and felt compelled to meet with Keanu in person. When they sat together, her first words weren't about money or design. They were about memory. My brother died by suicide 3 years ago, she said, her voice cracking slightly. He used to go to a place like this, sat in the corner every morning, drank coffee, never spoke. But he told me once, that place saved me longer than I can explain. We need more places that save people, not fewer. She offered to speak with the City Planning Commission, to advocate, to fight, not because she wanted to be a hero, but because for the first time in a long time, she remembered why she had started designing buildings in the first place, to create spaces where people could feel safe. The fight was far from over. The developers didn't back down easily. Meetings were held. Petitions were signed. Even a peaceful sit-in was organized, with people showing up in waves, sitting inside and outside the cafe, reading poems aloud and sharing stories. Sandra came every day, not as a celebrity, but as someone standing for something that had become sacred. Keanu, despite the mounting pressure, never raised his voice, never pointed fingers. He simply kept the doors open, kept the coffee warm, and trusted that love, when given space, could outlast even the coldest contracts. And then, one morning, just before dawn, just like when the first letter had arrived, another envelope appeared on the doorstep. This one was gold-edged. Inside was a handwritten note. To the owner of the cafe that taught us how to be human, we withdraw. The building is yours. Let it remain a place where hearts come home. No signature, no logo, just a small sketch of a coffee cup with steam curling into the shape of a heart. Keanu stood at the front door for a long time after reading it. He didn't cry. He didn't cheer. He just walked inside, turned on the lights, and whispered into the quiet. We stay. The legacy we leave in silence. It was a quiet morning again, the kind that gently pressed itself into the soul rather than announced its arrival. The city moved outside as it always had, rushing from one place to another, horns honking, buses wheezing to their stops, street vendors setting up for another day of survival. But inside the quiet corner cafe, time behaved differently. It didn't march or sprint. It flowed, softly, respectfully, like water curving around stone. The cafe had always been a refuge, but now, in the aftermath of what it had survived, it had become something greater. It had become a symbol, not of celebrity, not of protest, but of community. A place where strangers became family, and wounds were given the dignity of being witnessed. There had been no ribbon cutting, no grand reopening. The letter granting the cafe's safety had not come with reporters or headlines. Instead, it came with a stillness, the kind that settles deep into the walls of a place and hums like memory. Keanu arrived just after sunrise that morning, the same as he always did, hoodie pulled low, hands in his pockets, but this time there was something lighter in his step. He unlocked the door, turned the sign to open, and for a moment, just stood there in the doorway. No crowds, no noise, just one man honoring the sacred ritual, the daily opening of a space built on kindness. Sandra arrived a little later, carrying a basket of fresh books for the upstairs loft, and wearing that same soft expression she had worn the first day she returned. There was a calm between them now, a comfort that only forms after weathering something hard together and emerging not just intact, but stronger. They didn't need to speak much anymore. Their friendship had evolved beyond words. It lived in gestures, in glances, in shared tasks, and silent gratitude. What neither of them fully expected, however, was how much the world had been watching, not through a celebrity lens, but through the eyes of people hungry for realness. Over the weeks that followed, letters began arriving, actual handwritten letters, with stamps and creased corners, from people all over the country. A woman from Vermont wrote, "I've never been to your cafe, but your story helped me find the courage to leave an abusive relationship." A retired teacher in Ohio sent a letter that simply said, "You reminded me what my classroom used to feel like before everything changed." One letter, written in shaky cursive on yellow paper, came from a teenage girl in foster care. "When I grow up, I want to build a place like yours, a place where people don't feel like mistakes." It was overwhelming in the most beautiful way. Keanu, never one to chase attention, found himself moved beyond words. These weren't fans. They were witnesses, people who had seen what compassion could look like when given a home. He began collecting the letters, tucking them into a large glass jar that now sat on the counter labeled, "Proof that goodness still matters." People added to it, notes, poems, thank you cards. The jar never emptied. And the cafe? It grew, not in size, but in impact. Rosa eventually earned back custody of her daughter. They now came in every Saturday morning, sitting by the window, and coloring together while sharing a croissant. Gavier was approached by a small local bakery cooperative who had seen his story online. They offered him a place on their board. He declined, but only because he said his hands belonged here. Malik's letters eventually turned into essays, and those essays became a manuscript. Keanu and Sandra helped him self-publish it. The book, titled Letters to a Man Who Never Came Home, became a quiet bestseller in independent bookstores. Its dedication read simply, "To the place that taught me I mattered." Sandra had changed too, not just in how she spent her days, but in how she approached her own life. The rush of red carpets and premieres still came, but she began choosing scripts differently. She no longer looked for characters that would elevate her image. She looked for stories that could elevate someone's heart. She spoke of the cafe in interviews, not to boast, but to remind people that fame without purpose was an empty song. And then, on the one-year anniversary of the letter that saved them, the cafe held a gathering. Not a celebration, not a party, just an evening of open doors and open hearts. Anyone could come. Everyone did. There were no VIP sections, no performances, just live music from a local blind guitarist who had played for tips outside the subway for years. Tables were moved to the sides to make room for stories. One by one, people took turns at a mic that sat in the middle of the floor, not raised, just resting on the same level as everyone else. They shared memories, pain, gratitude. A mother whose son had died from an overdose. A Vietnam veteran who said this was the first place he'd ever been hugged by a stranger. A young couple who met at the cafe's book club and got engaged under the old oak out back. Keanu didn't speak that night, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't need to. Instead, he stood at the back with Sandra, his hand resting on his heart as he watched something he had built become something that now belonged to everyone. And as the evening waned, and candles flickered on tables, and laughter mixed with tears, someone from the crowd asked if Sandra would share a few words. She stepped forward, her posture humble, eyes shining in the soft light. She didn't prepare a speech. She didn't need one. "I once got turned away from this place," she said, her voice steady. "And at the time, I thought it was just a misunderstanding. But now I see it was a beginning. A beginning to something bigger than me, bigger than all of us. This cafe, this corner, it's not just a place. It's a reminder that even in a world that feels too loud, too fast, too broken, we can still choose kindness. We can still choose to sit with each other's pain. We can still build something sacred out of silence." There was no applause, just stillness. That sacred, heavy stillness that only comes when a truth has been spoken. The night ended with music, warm drinks, and people lingering not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And when the last person left, and the lights were dimmed, Keanu stood by the front door, looking at the cafe as if seeing it again for the first time. Sandra walked up beside him and asked, "Do you think the world will ever truly know what this place means?" Keanu smiled, slow and thoughtful. "Maybe not," he said, "but the people who needed it will. And that's enough." They stood in silence for a moment, side by side. Two people who had walked different paths, but found the same truth at the same table. And in that small cafe on a quiet street, in a loud city, in a complicated world, goodness stayed open. Forever.